Namaste, India, and hello to the world. My name is Preeti Chaudhary, and I'm your friendly host for today. Today is the day for Author Spotlight by Preeti Chaudhary, and my guest today is none other than my dear friend Probal DasGupta, who is a veteran, a corporateer, and an author. Let's get the evening kick-started, and for that, we have to have Probal in the virtual studio. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, put your hands together and let us say a resounding Jai Hind and thank you for your service, Probal. It's a very good evening, and it's my honor and privilege to have you here in my virtual studio. Today is Author Spotlight by Preeti Chaudhary with you on Watershed 1967, India's forgotten victory over China. And quickly for introductions, the people, the audience that have tuned in here today, Probal is someone who spent his formative years in my city. He went to school as a very young boy in Jabalpur, which is where both of us, which is where I'm from, and he spent his formative years at. And he remembers those streets and schools and places very fondly. We've had a chat about that one time before, but that's another story for today. He is a veteran, like I said, a corporateer who's been into business and all the rest of it after transitioning from the forces. And as of last year, he's a published author as well. So once again, welcome Probal to this edition of your Author Spotlight. It's over to you. Would you quickly like to tell us, please, why did it take 53 years for somebody to write about this kind of a book? And then I would like to get this conversation started because I think the context is so important to be said. There are so many things that were never said. Why did it take so long? And anything that jumps out to you that you would like to add here as well. It's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Preeti. Thank you very much, Jai Hind, and it's a pleasure to connect again. And thank you for the introduction, and as well as reminding me of the early years in Jabalpur. Of course, I spent a lot of time in Jabalpur and MP. Indore is the other city and Bhopal, of course, where I lived for a while. So it all takes me back to the early years of growing up and the fun time, of course. So that's that. But to your question, and before I do that, good evening, everyone. And Watershed 1967 is a book that happened after 53 years of the battles actually taking place. And Preeti is absolutely right. 53 years is a long time for an event or a set of battles which have been there in the book to be talked about or written about. Indeed, I get asked this question at certain places. I have asked myself this question before I started the journey of the book, because when I set myself to write the book, that was a question that was uppermost in my mind, that why hasn't anybody written about it? So during the course of writing, I figured that there are a few reasons that kind of jumped out as to why it took more than half a century. So the primary reason, I thought, as I spoke with sources, is that we are actually talking in 2020, and we are talking about 1967, when it was a very different era. We didn't have social media, of course, couldn't have thought about any of the kind of media that we have today. People were also not very much aware of what was going on in a remote Himalayan shelf of another part of India, which was actually not a part of India. So Sikkim was not a part of India, but something was going on there. And remember, 5 years before 1967, India had suffered heavy reverses and setback in a protracted war, in a short war rather, against China in 1962. So psychologically, it was very difficult for a lot of people to believe that India had actually put it across China in a set of successive battles. There was also the common references in that time of a 10-foot tall Chinese soldier, which was actually a myth, or it was also emblematic of the kind of psychological dominance that China had imposed in 1962 by way of virtually, sort of overpowering India, capturing territory, pushing India back, and thus imposing itself psychologically on our psyche. So that was one of the factors. So when those heroes who fought in 1967 went back and told people that, look, this has happened, uh, they were not readily believed to have been, saying what had happened in real terms. The media hadn't covered it either. So that those things that happened. Then so it was a young nation, not really confident of what it could achieve. As years went by, India really achieved a lot more, and it started off India's journey quietly. Then the second reason, leading from the first, is 4 years later came the 1971 war, and India recorded a resounding victory, which whitewashed everything that was there behind them, which included 1967. Funnily enough, that was a victory. But 1971 was so big that we are going to be, now celebrating 50 years of it in 2021. But 71 kind of came, and that was India's hour, India's time, and Indira Gandhi's war, and everything else before that was forgotten. And China reminded people of the memories of 1962. So nothing about 67 was thus remembered, recorded, and it was shelved and forgotten. The third reason, which diving a little deeper into it, was that at that point of time, it was the battles. Those battles were fought at a military commander level, at a military level. So the military leadership, General Sagat Singh, and the commanding officers of the Grenadiers Battalion and the Gurkha Battalion, who were leading those battles, were responsible for India's victories. Now, if you look at history, so there was not much of political involvement. So whenever there is lesser political involvement, what we have seen in history is the recording of those battles are not as as long lasting as when there are political involvement in wars, battles, conflicts, etc. Because the engagements are at a higher level, and then there is a political narrative that plays out as well. When there are military victories, very quick military victories, the narrative may or may not really be long lasting, because it doesn't become anybody's political narrative. A political victory is not as much there in the battles of 1967. It was a military victory. So those I saw as reasons why it got shelved. And India and China also post 67 kind of did not have relations. They kind of implicitly believed that they should not carry this further, and no one really spoke about it. And it was forgotten conveniently in terms of China's case, regrettably in our case.
Absolutely spot on. So, thank you so much for putting that in perspective. I think it is extremely important for us to go back and look at all these reasons and basically give the due respect where it should belong. So, thank you for that. And thank you, first of all, for writing this book, for setting the context and setting history and perspective properly. Now then, let's go right back, because you suddenly don't just get up one fine day and decide that you are going to write a book, because you have to have that mindset, that creative spark, or that will or creativity to want to write or do something. When did that start for you, Probal? How long back do you remember very distinctly when you realized that you did have a knack with paper and pen? Please take us through that early influence, those journeys, those stories, if you remember, and whatever you
Yeah.
remember of it, please. It's over to you. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. So, it started early on, of course. I the one of the early in the early part of life, and I grew up reading a lot of books. I think that was the early start. Uh, I mean, if you want to write, you have to read. I believed in that. You need to read how stories unfold, what happens. You need to have a basic love of reading, and so I remember reading books from a very early age. To your question, I think I remember to have written an article in the third or the fourth or the fifth standard, and it somehow didn't make it. to the school magazine because they thought it was not good enough. But I thought, I believed that it was it's a subjective part, and you can always be having thoughts and which you could put to paper. So because I used to read prolifically at that age, I used to be interested in various kinds of stories. That kind of set the ball rolling at a very early age, and I think thereafter, in somewhere in middle school, started writing more. I had an English teacher, Mr. Ahmed Ansari, who was my mentor in the early years, and he encouraged me to write uh, in school. Went to boarding school in Indore, and there I not. I mean, it was not just writing alone. It was writing, speaking, being involved in all kinds of activities. Helped grow the ability to put pen to paper and put ideas to paper, express oneself. I think that is important. Language is a medium, and ideas are thoughts that form inside your head. The ability to organically sort of use or transmit those ideas onto paper is something that you start to do. One of the earliest tips that I received was that to write, you must write every day or as much as you can, because you only get better with that. So there are some people who probably have a more natural ability to put things to paper. Probably I were, I thought I grew better or I learned more as a writer as I wrote more. And so I started early on. I was in school. I was writing school magazine. I was an editor. I was editing for the magazine. I was writing essays, getting involved in all kinds of contests that you have in school. And so writing was intrinsically part of me very early on. Uh, but life leads you into different directions. So in those days when you grew up, you couldn't grow up to be a writer. You had to do either an engineering degree or a medical degree, or you had to do something else and go to do something more productive commercially. So and that's how you went through all your exercises and routines and plans in the 80s. And so, of course, life took me to directions that I chose to adopt, whether it was, going to the armed forces or thereafter in the corporate life. But I think somewhere uh, writing was a part of my passion, and that remains so. Whether it was, writing pieces in while in the army, writing about experiences, writing fiction, non-fiction, because I read both kinds. Fiction is something that helps you to articulate, understand human emotions, the overlapping uh, aspects of emotions and expressions and experiences, to put things into perspective. Non-fiction gives you the discipline to put together facts, and Watershed was also, if you look at it, it's a non-fiction narrative. So you have
Yep.
the soul of fiction into the discipline, and the arc of fiction into the style of non-fiction, or the form of non-fiction that the book
Can you
presents.
just hold that thought for one moment, Probal? Because I am specifically going to request you to share
Yeah,
your writing journey.
sure,
And you know
sure.
what? I get it that the topic was pretty sort of there in your mind all the time because you are a veteran. You've
Yeah,
served in the forces. So, in the back of your head, the topic was very clear to you. So, I have extreme clarity on that. Though there are a couple of things which I will get to towards the end of this conversation.
sure,
But
sure.
for now, please help me understand when is it that you actually decided to sort of write this book, and thereafter, what has been your journey of sort of putting it together? If, please share with us also if there were any highs, any lows, and anything else in between. Writer's block, some
Yeah,
euphoric aha moments, all
yeah.
of it. Please do share.
Yes,
I'm
yes,
really excited to hear all of that.
yes,
Thank you.
yes, yes. So, interestingly, um you asked this question, which is a very which is actually one of those things that uh, that which is an inflection point in the birth of the idea and the birth of the book. The idea, I would put it this way, because this was an idea which kind of grew into a book. So it was 2017, and I'd taken 5 6 years to write a manuscript, and which is still lying on my shelf, one of my shelves. That's a whole big manuscript of a book. It's not yet published, but that is that was a manuscript. I had put together a story that was based in an area of insurgency. It's a fiction work of fiction, but I was discussing this with a friend of mine over lunch, and it was that time when India and China had a standoff at Doklam in Bhutan, and Chinese forces had arrived, Indian forces had gone there, and there was a standoff that was taking place. And that standoff was actually was in the news because everyone was talking about how China could again, go back to the events of 1962 and kind of put pressure on India psychologically. I was having a I was having lunch with my friend, and he mentioned that look, India and China, 1962, we've had a hard time, in that war. The Chinese prevailed. We'd suffered a lot of setbacks. So, the very tricky customers. What do we do? And this is something that we need to, because China was also, if you looked at television channels, if you watched news, or if you read newspapers at that point of time, they were all talking about how 1962 was a time when India had suffered heavy reverses. So I told my friend that, look, I see where you're reading the newspapers, you're watching the media, and so are we, everybody, and we are speaking about 1962. But do you know that? So I asked him, but do you know what happened when India and China last went to battle with each other? So he said China won, and I said no, it's India who won. So he was surprised, his jaw dropped, and he asked me, how is that possible? I said, no, it happened 5 years after 1962. And he's he's a he's a writer himself, and he's extremely well read. He's a very good friend. So he said, look, well, I never heard of it, and I realized a lot of other people had either heard of it briefly or had not known about it at all. Most people had not known of it. And you'll be surprised that people in the armed forces also hadn't known about it. Many people hadn't. Some people who are historians, who have interest in history, or in the military, who have interest in military history or past, or in India's past, would have known some part of it, but it was largely unknown. It was largely unknown, largely unwritten, except for a few blogs, except for some articles here and there. And then, so the friend I'm talking about is an author, and he said, why don't you send me a note, a one pager on this whole event that you're talking about, which actually changed the India-China narrative forever. So I sent him the note, and then we got talking. Then I was soon speaking with one of India's very well-known agents, literary agents, who took up the um, idea, took it to various publishers, and almost every publisher that he went to wanted to publish the book. So publish a book based on that idea. So finally, Juggernaut and us, we decided to go ahead with the book, and was very supportive of Juggernaut right from the start, in terms of how they would go about the structure of the book, how they would go to the market, what they would do, how we would work together on it. So I think that one moment is what changed a lot of things, because as I said, we were talking, and we took a break at lunch. We were having lunch, and during that time, we just got talking about Duklam, uh, and that's where when you look at a contemporary event, You go back to history to define it in some way. And the moment in history that we were looking for was 1967 and not 1962, as everybody would like us to believe during that time. And I thought this is a good time to tell everybody what actually happened 53 years ago. The publishers, the money publishers were quite excited by the idea, who wanted to publish an idea, if I may use a cliche, an idea whose time had come. So that's how it started.
Brilliant. So that is good. You went to an agent, and then the idea was spoken to a few publishers, and then you sort of honed down on one and started working right from the word get go from there.
Right.
But then
Right.
again, that's one side of the story. The other being the actual writing of this database tome of a few hundred pages. Tell us a little bit more in terms of, were there any highs or lows? Were there any ambiguities, any self doubts, or wherein you really patted your back and you said, "Well, Probal, that's a good job done." Tell us through a
Yep.
little bit of those emotions running through
Yeah.
you, please, in that
Yeah.
time. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. So it's like, when you are when you get an admission into a college or a school, or when you go somewhere and or you get a ticket to some big place. So when you decide on the idea and the book, and you believe it's a great idea, there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of energy. But as it happens with every book or a film or an idea, that the first part is the romantic part, where you're really excited about the idea, you believe this is an idea, which is the biggest one at this point, and nobody would have a bigger idea in this than the one you have. And I think that's a good point to start, because that gives you a lot of fuel, a lot of energy, momentum. At the same time, what tends to happen is, then you get down, you roll up your sleeves, and you get down to doing the more boring part, I would put it. uh, Writing, putting together facts and uh, inputs and thoughts of people. But I must say that one of the most fascinating parts of writing the book has been talking to the various sources, talking to various people who have been veterans of that time. When I was writing the book, I realized, and I told uh, Meher and some of the people who were helping me with the research, that look, this is one book that will probably not be repeated very soon, for one reason, because most of the sources uh, were in the 80s or 90s, and God willing, they'll have many more years to live. But I think the memory kind of will get to be slower, and will get slower as time wears on. So this was one of the things when I spoke with the sources, I realized that this is I had embarked on this journey, listening to these stories, these fascinating stories of men who had been a part of history in 1960s. Was one of the most fascinating things that I would encounter and I would engage in. I also realized, when I was talking to them, how robust and resilient their memories were. They could recount every minute, every moment, every time, every turn, every twist of those battles of that time, of their involvement, what happened, etc., which was quite fascinating. I mean, I wouldn't remember something that had happened a couple of years ago. But and there was a reason for it. The reason was that they were so involved in that moment in time, of which they were a central part, that they had lived this for a long time of their lives, and they could recount those events in such a fascinating, interesting manner. So that was the interesting part. Now I'll give you an example. You spoke about the lows, and so we had to, when you write, you do a lot of research. A lot of the research doesn't actually get into the book. You think that you've done a lot more, and all of that must get in. Everything seems to be very important to you. So I think the process of writing tells you to disengage emotionally at times, in order to get the best material out of it. And that's why you have a writer who writes, and there is an editor who's there to not be the best friend of the writer, but also we together are the best friend of the book that we're working on. So one of the things I realized is that we had done tons of research. There was lots of material, and the book underwent some stages of editing, changing at my own end, and along with my editor in terms of making it, uh, shaping it into a kind of form and narrative that is that helps get and attractive the attention of the reader right from the start, from the get go, and kind of continue the journey. And we had we agreed to a style, a form, a shape, and I think that kind of defined the narrative that it takes and the flow it takes from start to finish, which I'm grateful to my editors for helping me on that. I think that was a learning. As far as the laws are concerned, there were one of the things, there were not really laws, except for the fact that I don't think there was a writer's block per se, because what I would normally do is, because it was also based on inputs from sources and others, if there existed a writer's block, or if there was some time that I felt that I'm not in the mood to write, I would try and speak with sources because I would always be in a mood to listen. And and so you can switch roles of being a listener or a writer or a researcher, but it's just that you need to be playing different roles when you're doing that. But yes, so that was one, when you had to switch and need to get into another gear and understand what you could do at that moment better than just sitting down and writing something that you might ultimately term as rubbish. But it happens. You write and you reject it, and that happens often. But that's how you develop yourself in terms of your you mature in terms of your writing, etc. So one of the incidents I remember, I called up Colonel K.B. Joshi, who was the hero of Chola, who led the Indian army to recapture the Chola coast, and after which India and China, that was the last piece of action that happened between India and China at Chola. So when I called him, uh, he's he is an ex-officer, veteran from my regiment, 11 Gurkha Rifles. So he was not very initially. He was not very enthusiastic about talking about what his role in the battles, because I think nobody had written. So people had come and spoken with him earlier. Nothing had happened thereafter. So that's what his initial response was. So I had to coax, cajole, prod him to meet me, and he lived in Dehradun. He lives in Dehradun, and so he would. So then I was persistent. That's the other thing I learned, that you have to be persistent in order to meet your sources, to go then meet with whosoever you would want to, because that is important. So I I landed in Dehradun. I went to his house. So finally agreed. So I went to his house and I had taken an appointment. Um, and so he asked me. He said, "Okay, welcome to Dehradun." So he's 95. He's extremely fit, and he has his handlebar mustache, and he's a ramrod straight, and he speaks very clearly, and so yes, and a lot of energy uh, in him, and very eager he was to meet at that point in time. And he said, "Okay, so let's speak." And so, how much time do we have? Do you have any other? What brings you to Dehradun? Is there anything else that you have in mind? So I said, "Sir, I've come to meet you." So he was very overwhelmed. So, you know, from the first time that I called him, when he was not very enthusiastic to that day, he spent time with me, and he spent 5 hours from 4 in the afternoon to 9:30 at night. When I finally left his residence, he had spoken for 5.5 hours, and he spoke right from his journey in Burma, where he was born to his, I mean, a mathematics teacher. That was his father, and then his journey um, to various phases of life and to Chula battle that he fought. So it was interesting that when you meet with people and they talk about the journey, it was kind of very transformative because I got a lot of inputs, information from him. Then I remember going to meet another source, and he happened to be a former general. He was in Rajpipla in near Baroda. So I went to him and I met him, and he had been the ADC, the aide to General Sagat. So General Randhir, that's the gentleman I'm talking about. So when I met him, uh, he asked me, and he was one of the first sources that I met, and he was magnanimous enough to spend the entire day with me there. And so he asked me, Probal, what is the subject? What's the name of the book that you're proposing? Because he knew a lot about what had happened there, and he had shared his thoughts, his inputs. So he said, "What do you think would be the name of the book?" I hadn't thought of the name of the book until then. I just looked up. I said, "Watershed." So he said, "That's an apt name." So you know, later on, when what happens is when you write the book, the title of the book, the name of the book can change at the end, depending on conversation with the publisher and what they think is more marketable and how it should be, etc. A lot of things can happen. But interestingly, so when I proposed the name Watershed 1967 to the publisher, um, my editor thought it was a fabulous name. So we tried to explore other names, but none of the other ones kind of really stood out as much as Watershed 1967 did. And I'll come to it later as to why the name, and why Watershed, and how I instinctively sort of, replied to the general's question as to what the name of the book would be. So these little anecdotes, and I visited. There were times when I had to go and visit the source, and somebody was unwell, and you had to access records in Delhi. We're not very good with archives and records, and that's one of the reasons why history is not told as well in India, because we don't tell our stories. We don't declassify records. So if you ask me about the laws, I think the laws are the fact that you're not able to access records and archives in Delhi, because when you go there, there's a lot of bureaucracy, and you don't manage to do that as well as you should, or as well as one would in perhaps United States of America, because in India,
Yeah.
declassification of records don't happen. So you rely a lot on the sources, which is another great way of telling a story, because they are the people who actually bring the events live into the book. So yes, I mean there are these pushes, pulls, and pushes, but that's what makes it a fascinating journey. It wouldn't be fascinating if it were not for the various colors that kind of dotted the landscape of the making of Watershed 1967.
Absolutely. And on that note, could you please hold up the book for me? Because
Sure.
for the audience that's tuned in here today,
Yeah.
ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, here is Watershed 1967, India's forgotten victory over China for you. This is readily available on probaldasgupta.com. I have left the website in the comment section of this LinkedIn Live Author Spotlight with me, your host Preeti Chaudhary, and my guest today, Probal DasGupta, author, veteran, and corporateer. Thank you for pulling that out. Probal, you know, discipline, I can understand it comes from the background that you're from. So writing every day and then making sure keeping all the communication channels open, planning your travels to meet the sources, documenting all of that. It's all a journey and a learning it in itself. And you've just narrated some anecdotes wherein it's beautifully brought out the entire journey of those hills and valleys, that you have gone through. So I'm sure it is a really good experience that you have had. A lot of people out there who are thinking of taking up writing as a vocation, what do they need to keep in mind, from your own experience? What are those certain cues, do's and don'ts that you think everybody should be mindful of if they want to start on this journey? I think that would add really a good value to everybody that's out there. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an easy question as well as a tough one, because the way you look at it, it's well. I think one of the things, the easy part is getting yourself to believe, getting yourself to actually write every day. And I think that's one of the more important things in writing. That the more you write, the more I guess the more mature you become in terms of expressing yourself on and putting pen to paper. And the more you do that, and then I come to the harder part, is is having that core belief that what you're saying is something that couldn't be said better by anybody else. I think somewhere, if one, and that comes from, and that's why I said, one of the more boring parts but the easier amongst everything is to be involved in the in the exercise of writing. And I think that is what's very important. The other thing is, and that gives you the self belief to express yourself at the time of writing, or writing whatever. I mean, it could be an essay, or it could be a book, or it could be a paper. But I think being involved in the exercise of it is important. Second thing is, I think, and this is personal. Sometimes it helps people, but the more you read, and that's been one of my personal experiences, that the more one reads, the more one understands the different hues, styles, forms, texture of stories, writing, uh, and you form your own understanding of what constitutes uh, a narrative that's closer to your heart. So reading different authors, different genres is important. Whether you're a fiction writer, or you intend to be a non-fiction writer, I think it's important to uh, read as much and across different genres as you can. Of course, you can like certain books, you may not like certain other books, but it's important to uh, then read the ones that you like. And the more you read, the more you develop an understanding of. It's like you want to play a game of cricket, you need to be also watching um, the, the the more experienced cricketers play, so as to understand how the game develops inside their heads. What do they do? What are the styles they have? And it's important to therefore understand writing through a process of reading. And I think that's very important. Then, as a writer, I think one of the things that one needs to think through is, what is it that you want to say. You need to have a core message, and that core message lies uh, within you. It's not something that someone else is going to. You might read. He might help, or she might help reiterate something that you believe in. But I think there is a core message that you have, that you could convey, that you want to convey. Identifying that core message, what you want to say, is important. Yeah. Because writing is about something, having something to say, something important to say, something relevant to say, something that you've always wanted to express. And I think uh, the 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 the, the exercise of writing is basically expressing yourself. So that is important. And the last thing that I would think is to evolve one's own style. I said, you read works of different authors across different genres, but I think it's important to have your own voice, because it's as I said, it's your core belief in a certain idea. It's your yearning to say something, so you must say it in your own voice, in your own form, in your own style. That is when you're able to express it the best. I believe that's how one evolves as a writer, because each one is a writer um, in his or her own uh, shape and school. And I think that's important to believe in, and evolve one's own style, have something very specific to say, and keep writing as you go along.
Thank you. And 1 year of Watershed 1967. What's next? Film on the book, another book, more books, talks, workshops.
Yeah,
What's going
yeah,
on, Probal?
yeah. Thank you. It's been a busy year, Preeti. I think, and just to take a step back, when Watershed 967 was released, and this is, you spoke about the lows. I think the lows started with the release of the book. because when the book was released, we had one launch, and after that, the entire world walked into COVID. So I said, "There goes my book, and now nobody's going to read." But and so there were no book launches, physical launches. There were no bookshops where the book would be housed or put up in shelves. So there started a new way of reaching out to audiences, and that's where you learn how to talk to people through the medium that we are doing so currently. And the entire year was spent in countless webinars. I know, webinars have been so many that sometimes people wonder what is the new one for. But I think I'm grateful to a lot of people for engaging in the webinars on the book, and grateful to you as well. I mean, has happened through the year. And ironically, India and China had their standoff during a protracted standoff of 2020, and people wanted to understand what India and China rivalry was about. 1967 brought the entire context of all of that to the fore, and that was an era, that a period which changed the India-China narrative. So when you looked at current events, you kind of went back to 1967. So that kind of held the journey together. The conversation about India and China led everybody back to Watershed 1967. Coming to your question about what next, well, this continues. The journey of Watershed 1967 continues, because it's a book I believed that goes beyond a certain period of time in terms of reading, in terms of its context of history, in terms of its reference. Being a watershed, a political, geographical, and historical watershed that it was that year. But yes, one of the things that the book taught me was that people want to understand, listen, hear stories, know more about stories that have not been told often, or that have not been told at all. So we thought, and I believe that there are stories that have to be told, that lie in the recesses of history, and sometimes they've been forgotten. From 1914, 15 onwards, over 100 years, it has been that the Indian Army in its modern form has been involved in wars and conflicts in lots of places. So I thought of putting together untold stories, and stories that have not been, that either lines, footnotes of books or elsewhere, but there have been forgotten stories. And when you talk of wars and conflicts, gallantry is one of the features that is there, that's spoken about, but there are various human dimensions: irony, separation, different other kinds of experiences of people, and human dimensions of the army, the wars that they have participated in, the conflicts that they've gone through. And these dimensions are sometimes not presented in many areas and many books, because they kind of gotten over the years. So I thought, this is one time when we need to talk about the various dimensions of wars and conflicts, and the involvement of the armed forces, which is one of the it's one of the most diverse, most secular, and versatile armed forces that you can in the world. It's perhaps the most versatile. Yes, it is, in terms of its involvement in different kinds of wars, insurgencies, and over a period of history, straddling pre-independence era and post-independence era as well. So this book is something that I had in mind, and as we speak, we've just closed our contract for the book, and would be going ahead with it. And sometime in, hopefully in 2022, we should be able to bring that out. And hopefully
Brilliant.
it's interesting to read as well, and you give it the kind of attention that Watershed has found, which is what I'm grateful about. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, first of all, congratulations for number two. Number two coming out in 22, possibly. So,
Yes.
hearty congratulations for
Thank you.
that. And possibly, maybe even a movie or two. on Watershed 1967? Who knows? Because that option is also open. The OTT platforms are damn it as in galore. So maybe a series possibility. I mean, the opportunities are limitless from what I understand as a layman as well. So congratulations and all the best for that. Before we go, please, what is the story behind the name of Watershed 1967? And also, please, Probal, help me understand how a 53-year-old story, which probably started 2 years before that, so in 1965 per se,
Yeah.
why is it still contemporary as we are sitting in 2021 right now, especially with the background of 2020 standoff that you did touch upon earlier? So please help me understand these two things. First the story and then the entire journey of this watershed. What is it all about? Over to you. Thank you.
So sorry, I missed you a little bit in the first part of the question was about why Watershed 1967, why the name? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yes. So that's it's a very interesting question. It's a great question in terms of why, because I did refer to it earlier on in our conversation. So Watershed. I mean, when you look at India and China, and you look at as I said, the book started with references to 1962 in the media and everywhere, and I thought that that was, uh, a little misdirected, given that India had recorded a redemptive victory 5 years after 1962, which was 1967. That set the tone of India-China relations that followed in the years in the immediate period, and also it resulted in the the battles of 67 and the India-China rivalry during that period sowed seeds of suspicion and doubt in India's mind how about what China's plans were going to be after Tibet, given that they had captured Tibet in 1950 and they were at the door of Sikkim in 1960s. And they were actually raising questions to India. So that led to the integration of Sikkim in 1970s, and they followed again a rivalry of between India and China at Somdurongchu in 1987, which resulted in again India pushing back the Chinese forces without firing a bullet. And this time they had taken a page from the victorious battles of 1967 in terms of taking the advantage, wresting the advantage, the psychological advantage, and brought speed and surprise to their actions and pushed China back in 1987. So it had lots of repercussions. One of the most important things that 1967 it didn't do, but when you look at India and China, you look at 53 years, except for 2020 when you had the skirmish in mid 2020 when Indian soldiers and Chinese soldiers died, and thereafter, subsequent action took place as well um, in Ladakh. But if you look back 53 years, barring an incident in 1975 when an Indian patrol lost a few soldiers, for 53 years, India and China have not had a confrontation, a military confrontation. And you go back to that marker of 1967. 1967 did not actively change the India-China equation in terms of strategic capabilities, but it had a psychological impact on the Chinese, because of which, in the immediate period that followed, China was quite, in the period between 67 and then in the early 70s as well, there was not much that was happening on that side of India-China border, because there was a lot of the psychological advantage that India had wrested from China in 1967. Those two battles were important in that regard. Aside from other political changes that had happened, and there are lots of things. If I were to go into the historical side of things, history of what happened in 1971, the Prime Minister had taken steps to kind of ring fence us from China when she was going to the war against Pakistan. But those are other bits of history. What the major thing that happened is for 53 years, India and China did not have a military confrontation. And you go back to that marker of history, 1967. So that was the watershed, the historical watershed. And sorry for the extended explanation to the historical watershed. And then you have the geographical watershed, because that part, Nathula, Chola, those features, they are passes on the Himalayan watershed, where watershed is defined as the highest point, where the slopes there on either side, and the entire watershed constitutes the Indochina, India-China border there. So that is where the geographical watershed comes in, and then you have the political slash military watershed, because 5 years after India's loss or setback in 1962, India had put it across China in 1967, and therefore wrested the political and military advantage. So it was a political watershed, a military watershed, and a geographical watershed. And when you looked at India-China relations for over half a century, when you think of it, more than a quarter of the world's population haven't engaged in a war or a confrontation. That's a major happening. And when you look back at when it all stopped, you go back to that year, 1967. That's the watershed. So that's the name, watershed. It was it. I think it gave itself a name. I didn't give it. It just gave itself a name, and that's how it became the name of the book. How it's relevant to today's events is in the description that I just gave you. That for 53 years, the two nations had stayed away from the confrontation. And if you look at what happened in Galwan, China had broken the protocol. India and China had entered into protocols in the 90s and in the early 2000s that there's certain ways of avoiding a conflict, and the use of arms was not going to be there between the two sides. So China broke the protocol in mid 2020, and you had losses. Indian soldiers, brave hearts, lost their lives because China had made that first move, but the Indian army had hit back, wrested that advantage, and the reason why there was a longer standoff was because India had taken the advantage and taken the Kailash heights, and as the standoff wore on, what happened was that the Chinese forces had come and occupied certain places in the plains, but on the hills, in the heights around those areas, the Indian army had gone and occupied those heights, the Kailash heights, and they had so they dominated the Chinese army there, and it was a kind of a lock-in. They were locked in, where neither could move back without giving the other side the advantage, and that happened because you look back at 1987, where India had wrested the advantage against China in a similar kind in a standoff at Somdurungchu. And you go back to 1967, where India had given the Chinese a bloody nose by way of surprise and speed and aggressive posturing, and taking the advantage at a very early stage. So when you look back at different points in history, the one way in a limited scenario, in a limited battle or a limited area confrontation, to prevail over China, or to kind of have an upper hand, has been to move with speed and surprise the enemy, and take advantage of the local conditions. And I think every time India has managed to prevail over China, some of these factors have remained common. So when you look at 2020, what happened, in India kind of regaining the advantage, you go back to 1967 as the first time that India had actually done that and prevailed over China. So every time you look at some of these things that are happening here, the more you look at the present, the more you go back to history in terms of reference. Even in terms of political terms, 1967, in the 1960s, Mao, when he was faced with internal issues, the way he would respond was external power projection. So the more China has changed, the more it has remained the same. In 2020, because of the pandemic and the handling of the pandemic, there were questions on Xi Jinping's leadership and internally in China. And there were also question marks on whether he should continue. There was a coterie of senior party members who wanted the leadership to be changed. And how did Xi respond to the internal pressure that was building up? Through external power projection. So if you look at the 60s, if you look at the the current era, you would find similarities there. If you look at Xi Jinping, he came to power in 2012, and he laid down a 9-point agenda. That's a memo that he brought out, identifying the enemies and identifying what China needed to do to face up to its enemies, and that was as early as 2013. In 2015, he spoke about building a global navy for maritime navy for China by 2030. And from the time he has come, there's been 7 standoffs. So with India, and you go back to 60s, and you see how Mao Zedong was actually his stance at that point of time to respond to show China as a greater regional power. He would often take up the issue with India, whether it was to put pressure on India or to psychologically gain the advantage. Very similar in terms of the leadership, the political leadership styles, very similar in terms of the military outcomes. So the more you look at the present, the more you go back to past in terms of history, and the marker in history is 1967.
Thank you so much for that. It is all about drawing parallels. I think, it is in actually those literal terms, history repeating itself 40 years or 50 years apart. So thank you very much for putting that in context. And that brings us to the end of this conversation with you. This was Author Spotlight with friendly host Preeti Chaudhary, powered by StreamYard Incorporated. And my guest today is my friend here, Probal DasGupta, who is an author. He has written Watershed 1967, soon embarking on book number 2, which will be out in 2022. A corporateer and a veteran. It has been a pleasure, Probal. Thank you so much. For the people, please go on to probaldasgupta.com for his life, his work, his book, and everything else in between. Thank you to the audience for tuning in today. For the reruns, people who will be watching this on a rerun, warm welcome to you as well. And Probal, my dear friend, thank you for your service, and Jai Hind.
Thank you, Preeti, and thank you for having me here. And we really enjoyed our conversation. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.
Jai Hind.